Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and to a very special day in our calendar, which is the ceremony for the Lionel Gelber Prize for the very best book written in English or translated on global affairs. You can imagine, given what's going on in the world, that the interest in global affairs is at what we might call peak intensity. And there's very little prospect in the immediate future that that interest is going to decline. So a prize named in honor of Lionel Gelber, how many years ago? 35 years ago, was, I think, far-seeking and prescient by the family of Lionel Gelber, who made what is really, for me, an extraordinary decision. It is a decision to honor writers and writing. And again, if you think about how important writers are, who take a decade sometimes, as our winner did this year, take a decade to do the very, very best possible research and writing on an issue which is fundamental to global affairs. I think, again, the far-seeing wisdom of the family in making that decision is just extraordinary. So let me ask Judith Gelber, who represents the Gelber family and is chair of the Lionel Gelber Prize Board, to come up and say a few words. Judith.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the annual Lionel Gelber Prize presentation. It's a pleasure to be with you today to celebrate our 2025 winner, Sergey Radchenko. There he is. And his marvelous book, To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. And thank you, Janice, for inviting me to speak on behalf of the Lionel Gelber Prize Board. And thank you as well to Kate Jameson, Director of Strategic Communications, and her team. As Janice has said, the $50,000 Lionel Gelber Prize is designed to stimulate authors who write about international relations and encourage the audience for these books to grow. My uncle Lionel, son of immigrants, graduate of the University of Toronto, Rhodes Scholar who attended Balliol College, became a great Anglophile. It was in London where he spent many productive and congenial years, followed by time in New York City and Toronto. He was a man of his times, and through his knowledge of and profound involvement in the field of international affairs and government policy, continued to write, study, and advise governments, politicians, and what would today be called NGOs. His great legacy was this prize, established in 1990 to recognize the book deemed best of the year, published in English, on international relations. The winning book must be judged to deepen public debate on significant international issues, and importantly, it had to be written in a style that could be easily read and enjoyed by the general public. Born in the early 20th century, Lionel lived just long enough to see the Berlin Wall come down. Our winner, Sergey Radchenko, introduces us to and follows the leaders of Russia and the USSR from Stalin to Putin, and their striving for their country's recognition and legitimacy throughout this period and strongly today. If you truly want to understand Russia, along with its worldview, this is the book for you and us. And so says the jury. A prize is only as good as its jury, and the Lionel Gelber Prize has been blessed once again with an outstanding group of 5 jurists. It is they who have the difficult task of choosing the winner from amongst many, many excellent books, always with the guidelines in mind. So led by our indomitable jury chair, Janice Stein, who this year played quadruple duty as acting director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, jury chair, as well as professor of conflict management and advisor to prime ministers. One way or another, Janice has been involved with the prize since it came to the newly established Munk School in 2000. Joining Janice on the jury are, for the 4th year, Francis Gavin from Washington, the Giovanni Agnelli Distinguished Professor and inaugural Director of the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Of special note, Frank is an expert on both national security and nuclear security policy. For the 2nd year, Ian Martin, based in London, columnist for the Times of London, author, and the director of the annual London Defense Conference. John View, from London, advisor to prime ministers, and award-winning author. He is currently professor of history and foreign policy in the War Studies Department of King's College London, visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute, and senior advisor at the Australian National Security College. He lives the international life. And Nina Srinivasan Rathbun, professor here at the Munk School, an expert in international security with a focus on multilateral nuclear non-proliferation and counter-proliferation policies. Sorry. She has served at the U.S. State Department and in the U.S. Mission to International Organizations at the International Atomic Agency in Vienna. The Prize Board and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy are most grateful to all for your expertise, time, and insight, and especially for choosing the great winner that we have today. Thank you all for joining us here in celebration, and with that, I will pass the podium back to Janice, and I expect you to have a very riveting afternoon here.
Thank you so much, Judith. And my task now is to talk about the 5 shortlisted books that my fellow jury members chose, because all of these are wonderful books, each making a different contribution. I can't see the order on which they're listed, but I think Dollars and Dominion, U.S. Bankers and the Making of a Superpower is the first on that list. I see Nina shaking her head there in acknowledgement. That is a really wonderful book about economic institutions, international economic institutions, both formal and informal, and the influence they have on shaping the current United States and on shaping U.S. policy. It's written, as Judith said, in ways that the non-expert reader can understand. So let me encourage everyone to read that. Benjamin Nathan's To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause. First of all, what a great title. It really is. And it's about Soviet dissidents and the Soviet dissident movement and what sustained this movement. We often say that if we were all rational all the time, there would be no heroes, because heroic acts are fundamentally irrational. This book really goes to the heart of these kinds of decisions and explores why people, in this case the Soviet dissidents, commit themselves to what could be called a hopeless cause. And in the view of history, Sergey probably was a hopeless cause. So I think it's a foundational book, and it will be in the historiography of this movement. The Good Allies, that's about us. And what a timely book, by the way, to be on the Gelber shortlist. When I'm feeling most enraged, I think of sending that to Donald Trump and saying, read it, right? Because it is the story of the extraordinary collaboration between Canada and the United States in World War II, but the early collaboration, because of course, as everyone in this room knows, we were there before, and the support that we provided. Tim is an outstanding historian, and he's a wonderful writer. And for anybody in the room who's interested in that period, this is a wonderful book. Steve Cole, who is a prior winner of the Lionel Gelber Prize for his earlier book, The Achilles Trap, it's an amazing book. That's all I can say about it. It's based on the Saddam Hussein tapes and the trove of intelligence documents that were, the tapes were made by U.S. intelligence interrogators who interviewed, in quotes, interviewed Saddam Hussein for hours and hours and hours, and then all the documents that were seized. And for anybody who has any interest in the Middle East whatsoever, and this is Steve Cole has spent a long time working on the Middle East. This is an absolutely wonderful book. You know, the jurors were talking this morning, and one of the points that came up in discussion was Ian, who made this comment, and all of us shook our heads in acknowledgement how important great investigative journalism is. And Steve Cole is one of these journalists, how much they shape our understanding of contemporary history, and frankly, how fragile it is. Because the big journalists, big news organizations are getting fewer and fewer, and so the capacity to do this kind of work is much less than it might have been even 30 years ago, when newspapers like the Washington Post would take somebody off a beat. There was just a fabulous article in the New York Times, which is what we were talking about the history of the war in Ukraine, written by a journalist for the New York Times, who was funded by the New York Times for a year to do this interviewing and to do this kind of work. And it's a contributor. These are the kinds of things that lay the trail for books like these that can get written by outstanding scholars who draw on this material. So, and Ian is a journalist or a retired journalist. This is all by way of saying that the connections between the academic community and the really great journalists is a very intimate and close one. Well, you can imagine how much time the jury spent debating, and then we got to Sergey's book, which is called, so we need the slide to change now, so I can show you the cover. Thank you, Adam. It's called To Run the World, the Kremlin's Cold War Bid for Global Power. And let me tell you, the jury was blown away, is the only way I can describe it by this book. It is, when I was thinking how best to describe this book. Sergey, do you just self-describe as a historian? Okay, well, we described you as a historian, as a political scientist, as a sociologist, as an anthropologist who dug deep, as a cultural historian, and finally, and I think in a very, very compelling way, as a psychologist. This book has an extraordinary theme to it, which makes it a classic. This is a book that is beautifully written and will endure. And it's not a choice about whether you read this book, all right? Sergey is going to sign books when we're over, and you do not leave the building without a copy of this book to take with you. But Sergey's book is a fascinating discussion about how important recognition was. I would say to Russian as well as Soviet leaders, but this is about the Soviet period. And there's a phrase in there, I told Sergey this, there's a phrase in there that stuck with me. Greatness needs more than to be proclaimed, it needs to be recognized. And that, I think, goes to the core of what this book is about. What is recognition? And I hope Sergey will say something about this in the talk. And then I said to him, does this apply only to Russia? And with a kind of soft twinkle in his eye, he said, there's a subtext here. It is not the only great power that craves recognition, and that craving shapes its relationships with others. This is a truly brilliant book. I'm not going to introduce Sergey because he's going to tell us something about his life, knowing Sergey. So let me say only this to you, that when I called Sergey to tell him he was the winner of the Lionel Gelber Prize, he was stunned into silence. And then he said to me, tell me that again. Did I hear correctly? That is what you said, Sergey. I don't know where I caught you. And then he said, I am the first person ever born on Sakhalin Island to win a major prize. This is extraordinary. I think that tells you something about the journey. Sergey, please come and join me.
Thank you, Janice and Judith, for those kind words. I'm so thrilled to be here. I still cannot believe that I won this prize. You know, I get up in the morning with, you know, part of me, it's like this is about somebody else. You know, part of me says, have you heard that this guy, Sergey Radchenko, won this prize? The other part of me says, yeah, you know, isn't that strange? Like, yeah, you know, remarkable. So great honor to me, of course. I'm very, very happy to be here. I want to take you back to 1945, where this book ostensibly begins. And I will recount a little bit about the content of the book. And I would like to begin with the person of Joseph Stalin. There's a universally known rule Stalin postulated not long before he set off for Yalta, the conference that happened in February 1945. If you cannot advance, then resort to defense. But once you have accumulated your strength, go on the offensive. In his time, Stalin continued, Lenin did not dream of the correlation of forces that we have attained as a result of this war. Lenin never thought that you could be allied with one wing of the bourgeoisie and fight the other wing. We managed it. And then he added, and I quote, we're not guided by emotions, but by reason, analysis, and calculation. Joseph Stalin came of age on the periphery of a sprawling empire in the twilight years of Russian imperialism. Imperial conceptions, which included the idea of the spheres of influence, became part and parcel of how Stalin viewed the world and shaped his approach to 1945 into the post-war world. Now that the correlation of forces was clearly in his favor, he sought to extend Soviet influence into the heart of Europe. This is what he meant by going on the offensive. And he expected that the United States would defer to his ambition. America had its own sphere of influence, Stalin thought, on the other side of the ocean. And it would not get involved in European affairs, leaving the Kremlin in a position to assert its uncontested power across the continent. So what Stalin hoped to achieve at Yalta was American recognition of this new reality, and through such recognition, legitimation of his new role as the arbiter of Europe's destiny. It was a vision of great power cooperation based, as Stalin thought, on a realistic assessment of the balance of power. Only didn't work out this way. The American leaders were worried about Soviet ambitions in Europe, or were not willing to give Stalin a blank check even in countries that bordered the USSR, much less in those that lay beyond Moscow's immediate reach, but where the Soviets exercised considerable influence through local communist parties. President Truman, for his part, believed that in questions of the post-war settlement, the United States should get its way 85% of the time. After all, it had the atomic bomb, a very powerful argument in any diplomatic negotiation. Truman feared Soviet subversion and the spread of communist ideas, and therefore the extension of Soviet influence. Stalin, for his part, feared the spread of American influence, backed by the power of the US dollar. Seeing that the communist influence was actually beginning to wane even in areas under his direct control, the Soviet dictator abandoned his hitherto preferred project of left-wing popular fronts and began imposing direct communist rule in the years after 1945. And so the Cold War set in. My book, To Run the World, which I'm so excited to have recognized as the winner of this year's Lionel Gelber Prize, retells the Cold War from its origins and the immediate aftermath of the Second World War until its dramatic end in the late 1980s. What I tried to do, above all, was to show how Soviet leaders from Stalin to Nikita Khrushchev to Leonid Brezhnev to finally Mikhail Gorbachev perceived themselves in the world, how they pursued Soviet interests, and how they defined those interests. More than anything, in the book I look at the idea of greatness, what it meant to the Kremlin, why the Soviet leaders were so obsessed with it, why they were so single-minded in the pursuit of the so-called greatness, even at the great cost to their country and to their people. This is at first sight a strange question. The Soviet Union was certainly not the only country that historically has aspired to greatness, nor its leaders, the only leaders in history driven by ambition. If anything, struggle for power and for recognition of one's power by rivals as well as by clients has been a defining feature of international politics ever since recorded history. In this sense, the Cold War falls squarely within the broader story that takes us back to Athens and Sparta, or to China's war in states period, and projects forward to yet uncertain future. So we can say what we may about how unique the Cold War was, but in one respect, it was certainly not unique, and that was the struggle for recognition. No one wanted this recognition more than Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. We remember Khrushchev for his fist-waving and shoe-banging, allegedly, for his almost childish enthusiasm about the prospects of communism, but also of his risk-taking that brought the world to the precipice of a nuclear war. When in May 1962 he decided to send nuclear-tipped missiles to Cuba, Khrushchev wanted to prove that his was as great a country as the United States, that it had every right to protect its allies, even if, like the Cubans, they were deep inside what for Stalin would have certainly counted as America's sphere of influence. Yet he backed off at the last moment, showing that even in the striving for greatness, there were limits. Khrushchev was worried that a nuclear war could start inadvertently, by accident, or simply because of the breakdown of rationality. in the heat of the crisis. So he chose to lose face rather than play with fate. In his usual folksy way, Khrushchev recounted one of his favorite stories. This is the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He recounted one of the stories about a Tsarist army officer who accidentally, how to put it correctly, broke wind at a ball. So the Tsarist officer was very embarrassed by this accident. And he blew his brains out. That's a story that Khrushchev told. I don't know if it's a true story. Khrushchev told this story. He would not make the same mistake. Khrushchev would not make the same mistake. It was embarrassing to have his Cuban bluff called by the Americans, but he wouldn't do anything stupid and criminal, like, for instance, start a nuclear war over Cuba. When Fidel Castro hinted at the possibility of launching a preemptive nuclear strike against Cuba, Khrushchev was livid. "What is it?" he raved. "A temporary madness on Castro's part? Or is it the absence of brains?" Nikita Khrushchev was removed in a coup in October 1964. He was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, a consensus builder who wasn't quite as prone to taking major risks. He wanted rather to build a positive relationship with the West, in particular with the United States. He too craved recognition as a leader of a great power, to a greater extent even than Khrushchev in his time. By the late 1960s, Soviet power was already beginning to peak. If Khrushchev looked forward to a future when the Soviet Union would emerge as the world's preeminent economic power, for that was the meaning of the promise that Khrushchev had made, that we will bury you. For Brezhnev, this was no longer the case. He could no longer entertain this kinds of hopes. Soviet economic growth was slowing, and the Soviet Union was entering a period of stagnation. Brezhnev pragmatically set aside the ideological postulates and sought accommodation with the West in what became known as the Helsinki process. This process led in 1975 to the signing of the Helsinki Final Act, which in some respects was a replay of Yalta, only now the Soviet Union was somewhat less threatening and more decrepit than it appeared 30 years earlier. It had, however, the world's largest nuclear arsenal and an ambition to be recognized in perpetuity as one of the world's two great superpowers. Brezhnev thought that he had that recognition at last from Richard Nixon when they met in the United States in June 1973. Nixon invited him over to his residence in San Clemente, California. In a private toast over a late-night dinner, Nixon told Brezhnev that what the Soviet leader had wanted to hear. "The future of the world," the American president said, "is in our hands. And while you and I lead our countries, this future is in good hands." Brezhnev thought that the United States could be relied upon not to try to push the Soviets out of the Middle East. And for his part, as he told Nixon when they shared a helicopter ride from San Clemente, the Soviets, and I quote, "did not mind the presence of US forces in Europe." That is a crazy thing to say in 1973. The Soviets did not mind the presence of the United States in Europe. For years, the Kremlin had tried to break up NATO and destroy American alliances everywhere in the world. "This is our ardent dream," as Nikita Khrushchev has said about the idea of breaking up NATO. And now Brezhnev was willing to work hand in hand with Nixon to, as he put it, run the world, and that is the title of the book. It's actually a quote from Brezhnev. It was an unbelievable moment, and it didn't last. Why couldn't it? I don't know. And maybe we can get into this when Frank and I have this discussion later. Perhaps it was simply because for all the mutual rapport between Brezhnev and Nixon, there was an internal logic to great power competition. To cite a Chinese proverb, two tigers cannot live on the same mountain. And so détente proved short-lived. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, the Soviet Union and the United States returned to confrontation. It was then that the Soviet leaders began rethinking their relationship with China. Now, China was a fixture in Soviet thinking throughout the Cold War. In the 1950s, it was an ally. But Nikita Khrushchev never trusted Mao Zedong and very famously quarreled with him in 1959 when he traveled to Beijing. We have a record of this wonderful conversation where it just turned into a shouting match. Khrushchev was shouting at the Chinese were shouting back. And the relationship never recovered. Although the Kremlin tried to mend fences directly and through various intermediaries and well-wishers. My favorite episode of that was when in February 1965, Soviet Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin traveled to Beijing. He thought that there was nothing that divided China and the Soviet Union. They were both communist countries, so couldn't communists just talk to one another and agree on stuff? And so he reached out to Mao Zedong. They met, Kosygin and Mao met in Beijing. And Kosygin made the speech. So let's try to repair our relations. And Mao Zedong told him, our relationship, our struggle will continue for 10,000 years. And Kosygin was like, that's ridiculous. Can you not change your mind about this? And Mao Zedong said, well, since you ask, I'm willing to take off 1,000 years. Our struggle will last for 9,000 years. In 1971, Nicolae Ceausescu, remember Ceausescu, Romania's communist leader, traveled to Beijing, and he was trying to mediate. He was trying to improve the relationship between China and the Soviet Union. He was telling Mao, why don't you try to speak to them and figure it out? And here's what Mao said. Whoever pisses on our heads, he said, we have to retaliate no matter the size of your country and the number of atomic bombs you wield. And that put an end to that attempt. Brezhnev, for his part, was obsessed with China and the civilizational threat that, in his view, it represented. He did not trust Mao and tried to bring Nixon around to help him contain China. One of the most remarkable moments in writing this book, putting the narrative together, was to discover just how Brezhnev thought of himself as a European, and how he also thought that Nixon was a European. He would tell Nixon, we are Europeans, so we can understand each other, not like those Chinese. We don't know what they're doing, so we should work together to oppose China. This was the hope that Leonid Brezhnev had. Now, the Kremlin worried also that closer US-China relations would worsen Soviet isolation and tried to warn Washington to be sure, for perfectly self-centered reasons, not to overindulge in building up good relations with China. You may be in a euphoric mood now about China, Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko warned, but the time will come when you will be shedding tears. It's a warning from the Soviet Foreign Minister. For self-centered reasons, of course. They were not happy with a good Sino-American relationship. They were like, don't trust those Chinese, you know what happens. Yet soon Moscow too began its re-engagement with China. It was a strategic choice. The Chinese weren't going to go away. A better relationship was needed, and something changed too. For the first time, the Soviets were willing to accept China as an equal partner, not a younger brother, not a client, but a partner. It was Mikhail Gorbachev who understood this new reality better than most. And it was Mikhail Gorbachev who finally traveled to China in May 1989 to inaugurate a new relationship of equals. He met with Deng Xiaoping. It was a really interesting conversation because you know what Deng Xiaoping told him? He said, we quarreled during the Sino-Soviet split. We no longer think that the things that we said at that time were correct. But you know what really mattered? You looked down on us and we felt like we were being bullied. That's the reason. For his part, Gorbachev was happy to treat China as an equal partner. He also was a little bit opportunistic. He did not condemn the Chinese government, for example, for the massacre of students on June 4th, 1989. When he heard during a Politburo discussion that as many as 3,000 students had been killed, he responded in a way that you would not normally associate with Gorbachev. 3,000, he said, so what? They, meaning the Chinese, like us, have to hold on. That is to say, hold on to power. In fact, he thought that China's post-Tiananmen isolation was a good moment to try to foster closer relations with Beijing and also to bring India into this great power triangle. So he would reach out to the likes of Rajiv Gandhi saying, oh, look, the Chinese are isolated now, let's try to work with them, and then we'll create a triangle. Gorbachev liked to talk about triangles. So I do argue in the book that there was more to Gorbachev than met the eye, including continuities with previous Soviet leaders, but there were differences too, important differences. Gorbachev understood that the Soviet imperial grandeur had a hollow foundation. He wanted to rebuild Soviet leadership on a new basis, an ideational basis, on the basis of new thinking, which, as the subtitle to his famous 1987 book made clear, was not, quote, for our country, but also, quote, for the world. What he failed to realize was that claims to ideational greatness rang hollow in the absence of economic power to back them up. When the Soviet Union collapsed, I was not quite 12 years old. I was living in an obscure seaside town on the island of Sakhalin, 8 time zones away from Moscow. There were no indications, in my life at least, that things were about to radically change. And yet 3 years later, at 15, thanks to US government-funded scholarship, I was already on my way to the big wide world. I spent 3 years in Texas, a big change from Sakhalin, you'll have to agree, and continued to Hong Kong and later England. When I was 25, I was living in Ulaanbaatar, where I married a wonderful Mongolian woman named Onon. We then bounced around for a few years with a couple of suitcases and a young child called Nikita Averil. Naturally, Nikita after Nikita Khrushchev, and Averil, some would know, after Averil Harriman, which is what you would expect from a Cold War father, Cold War historian father. We even ended up in China for 4 years, just as Hu Jintao's golden age was giving way to Xi Jinping's uncertainty. That uncertainty proved too much for me, and after repeatedly running afoul of the Chinese government, I escaped to Wales, where I began writing this book aged 35. Now, the book took 10 years to write, and while in retrospect I would like to claim that it was because the book was so damn good, in reality it was because I procrastinated most of the time. In the meantime, we had another child, a wonderful Welsh girl named Inessa Nandan. Inessa named after the Russian revolutionary Inessa Armand, and Nandan because Nandan means treasure in Mongolian. A fluent Welsh speaker, Inessa for me is a constant reminder that life can take absolutely extraordinary turns. So now I'm 45, I teach history at an American university in Italy, and like the Soviets and the Americans in their time, I haven't tried to run the world, but I certainly have been running around the world, or either that or the world has given me a run around. Even my wife, a Mongolian, thinks that I'm too nomadic. One thing I never expected, however, was to win the Lionel Gelber Prize. It is a prize given to historians of the highest caliber, some of whom have inspired my work. It never crossed my mind that I would be standing here before this audience accepting this amazing prize. If I were a character in my own book, I would have said that it was at this point that Sergey Radchenko attained recognition, and through such recognition, legitimation. And so there's little else to say but to express profound gratitude to the Gelber family, to the prize committee, to my friends and colleagues who have been so supportive along the way, and to my wonderful and very international family. And finally, I wanted to recognize here Odd Arne Westad, a Cold War historian and my mentor, to whom this book is dedicated. Thank you, Arne, and thank you all. It has been a long, winding, arduous road, but one with plenty of adventure along the way, and I'm very glad that I've come this far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey. You see why I did not do a formal biographical introduction of Sergey. He does it with an elegance and a sense of humor that I could not possibly hope to match. Professor Frank Gavin, who heads the Kissinger Center at the School of Advanced International Studies, as Judith said, is our longest-serving juror after me, and I've asked Frank to lead the fireside chat with Sergey, in part because their scholarly interests overlap to an astonishing degree. So they will start us off, and at about 20 minutes into it, members of the Munk School community will circulate through the room. They will have little white cards. If you have questions, please put your question on the card, and they will bring those cards up to Frank, who will ask your question. I want to take just a second to recognize the Munk School Students Book Club. 3 of you are here. Our students commit to read all 5 of the shortlisted books and to engage in a discussion, which is really wonderful. We have your 2 questions, and Frank will start us off with those. Over to you, Frank and Sergey.
Excellent. Thank you, Janice. And I just have to say, what a remarkable honor it is to be here. This prize is really the prize in our field. And to be able to be part of this, and to the incredible generosity and vision of the Gelber family, thank you. This is extraordinary, what you've made happen. And I have to say, this is my favorite time of the year to come up to this, to read these books. We were joking last night, the only blip is around the holiday seasons when my wife is busy buying presents, the giant box of books arrives, and she's like, not again. You have a Kindle. I'm like, no. Every year, and so we have these wonderful box of books. So thank you so much to the Gelber family for doing this. And also, can we all give some thanks to Janice Stein, our remarkable leader in all this. Janice is one of those people that's so extraordinary. People know her from different angles, but can't pull it all together. In my world, she's known as this unbelievably brilliant scholar who's written path-breaking work on every aspect of decision-making. A journal that I am involved with, Texas National Security Review, she has published 2 path-breaking pieces in the last 2 years, absolutely extraordinary. You all know her here as the leader of this extraordinary institution, of this prize. In Washington, she's basically the shadow dean of our school. My dean and our university president, they do not do anything until they run it by. So you talk about a superpower. Janice is a true superpower, and it's one of the great honors of my life to be able to spend time with her. It's also a great honor to be here with my great friend Sergey. And this is a bit of an awkward thing being on the committee, because Sergey's a great friend and he's a colleague. And Nina correctly pointed out last night that I did hang back a bit, even though I love this book. And running the Kissinger Center, perhaps the best thing that has happened is bringing you on as a colleague. So I wanted to kind of keep some distance. But this is really an extraordinary book, and there's so many questions to ask. But I think it was such a moving, wonderful opening. A lot of times, I'm sure for the audience, they read a book and they wonder about who the author is. And you have such a remarkable story. You hinted at it. Maybe you could just tell a little bit about how you got to Texas, how that got you to Hong Kong, and then how you became this world-renowned scholar through a whole series of circumstances that in and of themselves would make a great history, if not memoir.
Thank you, Frank. It is indeed in so many ways remarkable. It's just completely accidental. I was very fortunate. I mean, I was growing up in an environment that was very desolate, isolated, even from Russia. It was part of the USSR, part of Russia, but it was so far east. That part of the world that Sarah Palin sends from the back of her apartment. It was... economically so underdeveloped, with very few opportunities to do anything in cultural sense, for example. But there was a lot of great, I mean, thank you, the Soviet book distribution system, we got a lot of books, so I was able to read as a child, and that was fantastic. But I certainly never dreamed, I never had this sort of life trajectory in my mind. But then an extraordinary thing happened, and that is the Cold War came to an end. And there was an effort by the United States to bring young Russians out of Russia, to bring them to the United States so they learn a little bit about the way that democracy operated and freedom worked, and hopefully then went back to Russia and changed it in a more democratic and free direction. We can see how that worked out. But it was a great effort. It was led by Senator Bill Bradley, who was who I think was the key legislator pushing for what was called Freedom Support Act. And that was one of the kids who were taken. I'm so grateful for that opportunity because, of course, it was funded by the US taxpayer. Effectively, I was taken from Sakhalin and airdropped into a family in Texas, in East Texas. So I was there for a few years, and I had a remarkable time.
You became class president, didn't you?
I was a class president at
The only non-football playing Texas class president, I think, in East Texas history.
Yeah, indeed. And I was studying at a deeply conservative religious institution called East Texas Baptist University. And so for them as well, it was a new thing. It was like, who is this guy? So I had a great time. But then after spending 2 years at university there, 1 year in high school, I finished my high school in Texas. Then I went to university for 2 years. There was an exchange program, an opportunity to go to Hong Kong, and nobody wanted to go. I said, well, I'll go. And so I became the first American exchange student from that particular university to go to Hong Kong. It was a really crazy time to be in Hong Kong, too, because it was just after the handover. So that was how a lot of people assumed that I became interested in China. And China takes such a prominent place in my book because I was grown up next to China and so on and so forth. In reality, it actually was much more complicated because I was growing up in the 1980s and the relationship was still pretty frozen. It was not great. Japan was very close to Sakhalin. We could receive Japanese broadcasts, and I would watch Japanese cartoons without understanding anything. But that was the extent of my exposure to the to the East, so to speak. But then, while I was in Hong Kong, I really engaged with the local culture, language, traveled across China, and really fell in love with that country, and wanted to do more on this. I eventually went to London to finish my studies there at the LSE, and this is where I also began my PhD, working with Arnie Weststud. And the fun part of that story is that I was kind of desperate in London. I was quite poor, and then I was trying to figure out where to go in order to be able to afford my rent. And thanks to Uncle George Soros, I got a position, a fellowship in Mongolia. So I went to Mongolia, and while I was doing my PhD,
Rent was a little cheaper there than London?
It was definitely cheaper than London, I have to say, and I didn't have to sleep in the computer room, which was my regular abode at the LSE. But then I went to Mongolia and had a great time. I was teaching there at the Mongolian National University. Obviously, got married there, and it goes on and on from there. But it is a strange story, I have to say.
I just think it was important for the audience to hear, because we're in a period now where it seems like these kind of opportunities don't appear to happen much now, and to have your personal life story is just so extraordinary and uplifting in so many ways, and a reminder of some of the good things that are possible. I want to turn to your incredible book, and there's so much we could talk about, but as you know, for you, beautiful writer, it's very accessible. Some of the people who have read it might not be aware that the sort of territory that Sergey is working in is a very controversial one, about what drove and shaped the Cold War. And I grew up with the great battle between, it was ideology, right? You've got Soviets Marxist-Leninism. The Americans have their own sort of revolutionary ideology. There's this competition. That's one explanation. And people could come and say which was better, which was worse, but that's what shaped and drove the conflict. There would be others who would turn around and say, no, this ideology was just kind of papering over material interests, balance of power. You have these two great powers, and they were fighting over these power vacuums in Europe and East Asia. It was inevitable they would have a conflict, right? And that's where the debate was. And you came in and said, you're both missing the point, that it's this, there's elements of truth to both, but at heart, you can't really explain this conflict and how all-consuming it was without understanding this desire for recognition, which maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to that, what the reaction has been. Have you won any converts over? How you sort of, because this is a very powerful, important argument.
Thank you, Frank. I mean, first about winning converts, one thing that just I find so remarkable is I see people reading this book and agreeing with me. I mean, you've read this, it's a long book, right? So I feel very humbled by the fact that people are taking this argument as seriously as I try to present it in the book, despite the fact that it is a very controversial argument. I would say that I have a natural predisposition to take ideology slightly, shall I say, lightly. I think that's part of historians. We filter history through the eyes of our own experience, right? And if you think about my experience and how it overlapped the time that I was coming of age, it overlapped with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the complete disappearance of ideas that presumably drove the Soviet project forward. And some of the same people who were communists suddenly became the Democrats overnight. No, communism, this was all a mistake. Now we're Democrats, we love democracy, etc. And then, think of Yeltsin, for example. Look at his own career in the Communist Party before he became the grave digger of the Soviet Union. And then some of the same people turned to Putinism. Their experience with democracy was actually remarkably brief, and it felt like they were changing ideologies, like they were putting on new suits, taking an old one out of the wardrobe or whatever, put in the wardrobe and putting on a new one, and that this was not the essential thing. And I think that experience of living through that and seeing that is something that made me a little bit more predisposed towards looking for other answers and other motivations, explanations of human behavior. And what really there was an eye-opening moment when I simply had the opportunity, the fortune to go through all the tens of thousands of pages of Soviet records mainly. This book is mainly based on the Soviet archives, which inexplicably opened up just about 10 years ago. Inexplicably, because you would think, come on, in Russia, where they have this increasingly brutal dictatorship, why would they suddenly open up the archives? And I don't think there's a conspiracy theory involved, but I don't want to even go there. But anyway, the materials have opened up, and you could look at personal papers of people like Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, Gorbachev, and suddenly you realized, with all these materials at your disposal, you realize what really drove these people. They were so insecure, first and foremost, about their standing, their position, and they so craved recognition. They wanted to be recognized as these great leaders of a great country. And so that became the theme that underpinned the book. That does not mean that I throw ideology out of the window. What I'm saying in the book, the argument is a little bit more nuanced than that. I say that basically what mattered was worldviews. Worldviews really did matter. I do not argue in the book that worldviews did not matter. And worldviews are composed of various influences and things, right? Including perhaps some references to formal ideology, whether it's Marxism, Leninism, or something else, but also cultural influences. One of the things that struck me as I was working on this book is just how Soviet leaders were deeply, I guess I should just use this word, racist about Asia. Their approach was explicitly racist, and you were like, wait a second, racism and Marxism, Leninism, that's not, that's not this, it comes from somewhere else. Right. And so you gotta have a deeper appreciation of that history, of their environments, of their backgrounds, where they came from, what events they were influenced by. For example, the Soviet leaders were deeply influenced by the Second World War in so many profound ways. And then you form a view of their worldview, which then fed into policymaking. But yes, I have heard some criticism of my position from various people.
Well, something you said is very interesting. There's, Janice mentioned this wonderful book club that Isaac, the author, runs, and shout out to you guys for doing this. It's really a remarkable commitment to read these books. And one of the terrific questions had to do that they wanted to ask was about this issue of the role of psychology. One of the things reading your book is you feel like you're in the head of Stalin, of Khrushchev, of Gorbachev. And so I just a general comment about the importance of understanding the psychology of leadership. I think we'd love to hear about that. But as a historian living in their heads and getting to know them, what was that like? Did you find yourself more sympathetic, less sympathetic, understanding them but not liking them? And I know this is tricky, right? Because you're not going to come out and say, that Stalin was a great guy, but how did you can't help when you're so immersed, you're living in their head and they're living in your head. What was that like? And then just also to the earlier question, how important is that act of understanding the psychology of leadership in making these evaluations about consequential events?
Frank, I think it's massively important. I think that's why historians cannot stay within their own fields. They have to go a little bit beyond, or maybe far beyond, the immediate history, the stuff that we do. I never used to be able to do that because I didn't have the time, and I was working in my PhD and tenure and various other things. But now I had this project before me that was very ambitious, and I could really try to connect to other fields, including fields like social psychology. And I did feel, and even psychiatry, I felt at times like I was a psychiatrist talking to those patients. Soviet leaders, or the Chinese leaders also feature very prominently. They had the same problems, by the way. It's like they called on their counselor, and here I come here. Let's talk. And of course, I would not say anything, but that's what counselors do, right? They just listen. And so they will just rant and show their various fears, obsessions, and etc. And I think that is so important to understand in how we deal with history, how we write history, understand what those people were concerned about, what they were worried about. Did I feel sympathetic? Sometimes, not for Stalin. I think Stalin does not really inspire sympathy in any kind of way. He was a very deeply brutal, deeply cynical individual. Some of those other people, sometimes you feel for them. You think, they are brutal on occasion, and on other occasions they're just kind of funny and desperate, so desperate to have their status recognized, like Nikita Khrushchev. And remember that infamous kitchen debate with Richard Nixon. I had the Russian record of that, which is even funnier than the American record. It just shows how insecure he was, and like, oh, we also make these things. We're also up there. Leonid Brezhnev and his love for Richard Nixon. Oh, he loved Richard Nixon. And he was so disappointed that Richard Nixon was clearly overthrown by his enemies in Watergate. One of the craziest stories in the book is how one of Brezhnev's aides wrote to the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, saying, do we have any compromising materials on Nixon's enemies? We have to help him. We have to help him. And Andropov wrote, like, okay, maybe. Let's see what we have.
That's
So-
fun. That's amazing. Now, by the way, people have questions, write them down. I'm collecting them. And a set of questions have come up, and I'm going to try to pull them into one. As Janice said when she was introducing you, this desire for recognition, we recognize this psychologically as a part of the human condition. We also, you hinted in your opening comments about when Truman says we should get our way 85% of the time, and we can imagine that this being kind of a universal phenomenon. On the flip side, there is this question about Russia, the Russia problem, right? And I always think back to when you read Kennan and the Long Telegram. Sometimes it's about Marxist-Leninism. Sometimes it's about the Russian Empire's just natural desire to grow. Sometimes it's about something about Russia's soul, right? And this gets to the question that several people sort of asked about. This is the continuity between the czars to Stalin to Gorbachev to Putin, right? And so as you were doing this, because I think when we all learned about the Cold War, we said, well, the Cold War is the problem. But as time has gone on, and implied in this question is there's something about Russia that generates the issue. And so I know that's a tricky one, but I wonder how you've thought about that, both the sort of continuity that you show in the book, and there are all these sort of references to Imperial Russia, and then Putin obviously uses this language. How you feel, because in an interesting way, this is another, to your point about ideology, it drains away even further. There's something about Russia's view of itself and place in history that seems, despite pretty dramatic changes in regime type and pretty different personalities, comes back again and again. Is that fair to say? And if it is, how do you explain that? What is your analysis of that?
I think it's fair to say that. There is something we'd call Russian exceptionalism, just as there's something called American exceptionalism. I think the Chinese also have that. There are some countries around the world seem to have that historically different times. And in Russia's case, it has lasted longer than you would think feasible or possible or necessary. The Russians have had this ambition to be recognized as one of the great powers of the world, and it is a historically continuous ambition. It just goes back. It really goes back to the days of the Russian Empire. It runs through the entire Soviet period, and it connects us to where we are today with Vladimir Putin. It's the same ambition to be recognized as this great country, and the elites feed this ambition to the population, who are actually willing to go hungry, but they want to be great. They want to feel great. One of Russia's problems historically as well has been that it has not matched its ambition with the means. It never really had the means to this remarkable greatness. They had at different times, they thought they were sort of getting there. This was especially the case in the late 1950s with Khrushchev, who believed in the promise of communism, and also there were some real breakthroughs for Soviet technology. I mean, Sputnik in the skies, that made them feel, wow, we can actually do it. We are it. We are the great power, and everybody will have to kind of bow down and recognize it. But then that moment was fleeting, and things really started going downhill from really the mid-1960s. In 1963, the Soviet Union had to spend a considerable and not insignificant part of its gold reserve to purchase grain to feed its population. Great powers do that, I guess, maybe. But for them, it was a setback after setback after setback, and by the time you get to the 1980s, there was a clear recognition on the part of Mikhail Gorbachev that something was fundamentally wrong with the system, but the ambition was still there. I mean, this is the irony. And this is, by the way, when people say, well, if you say it's all continuity and it was all the same all the time, how do we explain change? After all, and the fact that I'm sitting here itself is a testament to the fact that something happened in the late 1980s. There was some kind of a profound transformation, and the Soviet Union collapsed, and some, little guy, Sergey Radchenko, 15-year-old from Sakhalin, was able to escape that empire to go and live in Texas. Surely that's an obvious fact that shows that there was change and not just continuity. And I would say yes, obviously there's change. But what we see is the role of individuals here and the recognition by individuals, including people like Mikhail Gorbachev, that you could not continue in the same kind of way. So Gorbachev tried to reshape that or redirect this trajectory in slightly different way. He still aspired to greatness, but he wanted ideational greatness, and he wanted to recreate rebuild Soviet leadership on an entirely new level, on sort of everybody follow us because we are prophets of the new world and will show the way to the future. That's how Gorbachev was trying to present perestroika and new thinking to the broader audience, and he was so disappointed that in the end nobody really wanted to follow him, and especially Eastern European countries were like, thank God, this empire is collapsing, we're running away from it.
Yeah, I will say, I'm worried when I go back to the U.S., I'm going to have to find whatever gold I can to be able to get wheat. And every time I look at a newspaper, it looks like we might be returning to that, so perhaps there'll be some lessons from that. But one of the other themes that often comes up in Russia's relations with the West is the missed opportunity thesis, right? And I was thinking about that. You have this description, I'm having this, picturing Brezhnev and Nixon and San Clemente by the pool, both wearing their probably dark shoes, walking on the beach, as Nixon often did. And here's this point where Brezhnev's, you could say, we've made it, right? But then there's another part that turns on it that says when that desire for recognition is endless, there's not an end point. Mm-hmm. One of the things, when you think about Russia's relations with the West, and particularly in the communist period, but also after, the missed opportunity of 1917 during the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the sort of the intervention, the Allied intervention in Russia. You think about the origins of the Cold War and the lament over was there an opportunity to establish this relationship. You think about the détente period that you sort of highlighted so much, and then you think again about the late 80s, early 90s. There's always this sense that there was a missed opportunity, and sometimes people will portray that as, well, people in the West just didn't understand. If only they had supplied this recognition, if only they had met some legitimate interests, if only they had done something differently, the relationship could have been better, right? Mm-hmm. More than in any other relationship that you can think of, this is a returning theme. What do you make of that? How do you evaluate that? Is there something to it? And if your argument is that recognition drives so much of it, is there a point where a leader, a state, a culture, a society says, yeah, we feel pretty recognized, we're good now, right? So how, or is it just an endless ambition driven by whatever insecurity, whatever the factor is, where I've gotten this recognition, I need more recognition?
I struggle with this, and the 1970s is a great case in point, right? It's a very interesting moment where you have these two leaders that are on very good terms with one another, and Brezhnev clearly is, and Brezhnev is talking, in 1973, he's saying the Cold War is over. We're so glad that we have this wonderful relationship with the United States. He's talking up prospects of economic cooperation, and this is the time just shortly after the Soviets discovered this massive reserves of oil and gas in West Siberia. And they're like, we are selling this stuff to the United States. And if you look at the early 70s, there's this great discussion of pipelines. They're talking about sending LNG to the United States. Brezhnev was so keen on that, and he thought that this was a new moment for these two countries. And yet, there was something fundamentally unstable as well about this relationship. At times when the Soviets got an opportunity to stab their American partner in the back, sometimes they did, not always, but often they actually did that. And the Americans did the same thing. They would stab the Soviets in the back just like that. The key example was the Middle East. In the Middle East, the Soviets were so outplayed by our favorite character,
yes,
Henry Kissinger.
This is one of the questions, and it's of many of the questions that has been asked, it's very clear what's on Canada's mind. A lot of comparisons of what the current American president is and how he will respond to recognition and so forth. And I may give you a chance to answer that, but I do want you to tell this story because it's one of the key parts of the book. And the center that we participate in, and we had the great honor of getting to know Dr. Kissinger. His handling of the Middle East crisis that begins in October 73 is held up as this sort of highlight of his great diplomacy. And you tell the story from the Russian side that is riveting and fascinating. Maybe you could briefly tell us a little bit about that and how it's different than the story Henry would tell.
So the story is probably the longest story of the book. I mean, the book is already pretty long. I have to say, I had to cut a lot of material, by the way. It was so exciting because I had all this new material and I thought, oh, I want to put it in. There are all these wonderful stories. And of course, my publisher, Cambridge University Press, said, you're kidding us, because this is not actually physically publishable in this kind of, it's just too long. So I had to cut a lot of stuff. But the one on the Yom Kippur War of October 1973 is, I think, one of the better documented, very, very interesting stuff there on the Soviet thinking, the Politburo discussions, how Brezhnev was just absolutely obsessed by the Middle East, and he was worried that a war would break out. He was worried that the Arabs, as he would put it, do something stupid, like invade Israel, and he was worried about Israel basically wiping out the Arabs. Why was he so worried about it? Because the Arabs were armed by the Soviets, and they were Soviet allies. So if your allies being wiped out by Israel, and this doesn't look good for you, right? It doesn't. It's not in terms of recognition. It doesn't do the job. So he brought that up. He actually would raise it with Nixon repeatedly. The funny thing, and this is really where international history is such a wonderful field, because you have the American records of this story, right? But then you also have the Soviet records of Brezhnev's meetings with Nixon, which are much more detailed and that cover different material. Why is that? Because Brezhnev would wait until Kissinger left the room, because he thought that Kissinger was pro-Israel. He thought, this Kissinger guy, we cannot trust him. So he tried to make the pitch to Nixon directly, like, let's keep Kissinger out of this. Let's try. And then of course Nixon would not really be pulled along. He understood what the Soviets were trying to do, and that is they were trying to assert their position, their influence in the Middle East. And then when the war actually broke out, there was a moment where the Soviets actually looked to this as an opportunity for great power cooperation. So they did. I mean, Kissinger was in Moscow. They tried to work it out. They imposed a ceasefire later on Israel, which did not exactly go in the direction the Soviets expected, which brought us to that moment where Brezhnev started making ultimatums to the United States. And Kissinger, it was Kissinger more than Nixon, actually. Nixon was somewhat out of this, but Kissinger raised the DEFCON level of nuclear readiness, and the Soviets were just totally freaked out by this. So at the same time, you have a détente situation. You have this historically best relationship between two Soviet and American leaders, and yet they're having a crisis in the middle of this, and that just showed how unstable that relationship was fundamentally, because you do have two superpowers, two scorpions in a bottle, right? And it's difficult to achieve a real cooperation between them, which I think sends a poignant message about where we are today.
Well, that was the last question. Very quick answer, or Janice will run me out of town. But I've got about 7 cards here, all asking pretty much the same thing: where we are today. How, through this lens of recognition, are we to understand the world we're in? And as going by the cards, we're not going to limit this analysis just to Russian leaders. How does the framework you've developed so brilliantly help us understand what is going on today, not just in Moscow, but in Washington?
So it is an interesting moment, and one comparison people have made is with Yalta. I began my talk today with Yalta. Now, one reason that Yalta did not work out was because Soviets and Americans fundamentally had a different vision of the world. Stalin thought in 19th century imperialist kind of division of the world into spheres of influence. I don't think FDR and even Truman, much less Truman, thought about the world in those terms. They wanted an open world, open to American influence, open door policy, etc. And it was that clash of visions that I think drove the Cold War. Where we are today is in a different situation, because it seems that perhaps President Trump does think in those 19th century terms. And in this sense, he's more aligned in his vision with, for example, Vladimir Putin or President Xi Jinping of China. But there's nuance, and that is in 1945, Europe was prostrate. The Soviets had their post-war planning. It's crazy to read it today because they were so ambitious. They wanted to basically control Europe. They wanted their influence to extend to Sweden and also to Africa. They wanted a colony in Africa, a story I tell in the book, which is hilarious. Europe could not do anything in 1945. It was overrun. It was a vacuum of power. Today, we don't have a vacuum of power. There are other players out there who are not so happy about a world divided into spheres of influence. There's Europe, there's Ukraine that is currently destroying, downgrading the world's supposedly second most powerful military in eastern Ukraine, and has been doing it for 3 years, holding up like this. So it's a different world, and I think those conceptions of the 19th century that Stalin also wanted to continue after Yalta, and then Brezhnev tried to implement after the Helsinki Final Act, this idea of division of the world into spheres of influence, I don't think it works anymore.
Well, that is a optimistic note to end, and we could all use some optimism. Sergey, thank you for your wonderful conversation. Thank you for this tremendous book. And I gather Sergey's going to stay, sign some of them.
Thank you both. Thank you, Frank. It was a wonderful conversation, and thank you, Sergey. Let me also say once again, thank you to John Bew, who's here. Thank you to Ian Martin, who's here, and to Nina Srinivasan-Rathbun. They were fellow jurors, and there is nothing better guaranteed to produce a great winner and a great conversation than having jurors of the quality of this jury. So thank you to the jurors, is all I can say. Let me also tell everybody that this program was recorded for CBC Ideas, so you will be able to hear it on CBC Ideas at a future date, and we will, of course, share it once the official airing of the program is over. Let me say again, thank you to the whole Munk School team who works hard to make this appear seamless. It is never seamless behind the scene, but if we've made it appear seamless, that's wonderful. And last but not least, the greatest debt of gratitude to Judith Gelber, to Sarah Charney Gelber, and to Patty Gelber for a partnership that is now 25 years old. But as I said, for the vision to celebrate the Sergey Radchenkos of the world who start their life in Sakhalin Island and then produce what the whole jury thought was a magical piece of scholarship. If I can invite Judith and Sergey to come over here for a moment, because there is a prize Sergey with Judith is going to present to you. When that is over, you are all invited to a reception outside, and there is a book signing table. And remember, you don't leave without a book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's been great. Thank you. Judith said the check is in the mail. The jurors wanted to know if there was a hologram check like this. I wasn't sure about the answer, but as Judith says, there is a $50,000 prize for 10 years of work. Just think about it that way. Thank you all for coming. You're all invited to the reception outside. And when Sergey stops smiling, he's going to start signing. Thank you all.